Okay. Today we're going to talk about 9.2 technology advancements and limitations when it relates to disease, something that's very relevant to the day we live in today. Our central question for this topic is: to what extent did disease change during the period from 1900 to the present? So I also want to kind of make a note to try not to focus the entire answer on the situations going on today. If you want to make comparisons to what's going on today to stuff that's gone on in the past, that's perfectly fine. But we're looking at the entirety of this period, 1900 to today. All right. So curriculum says diseases as well as medical and scientific developments had significant effects on populations all around the world. And some highlights, I'm not going to talk too much detail about them, but vaccines and medicine, something we talked about in 9.1. Organizations, supranational organizations such as the World Health Organization, which keeps an eye out for pandemics, things like that, to give warning and to prepare, try to slow these pandemics, give resources to countries who need them, and so forth. Very much relevant to today. And another example is Doctors Without Borders, where you have parts of the world that are much more developed than others, and the ability to get medical equipment and medical training and such is more apparent in some areas. And so, Doctors Without Borders is a non-governmental organization, nonprofit, that takes volunteers in the medical field, and then they will go to areas that are in need of medical assistance. So, even lesser developed countries having at least some access to trained medical doctors will play a big role in helping with populations being able to sustain life much longer than they have in the past. So the world's population has dramatically increased a lot since 1900, and so you can see this kind of general rising up of the population. And in 1900, things would hit, and then boom, it takes off significantly there. And it's not just because of our ability to help people live longer through medical advances in science and such. You also got to consider in like the Green Revolution we talked about last time. But generally, one of the big things is that because of medical and scientific improvements, our ability to understand the body and how to fight infections and development of vaccines and other medical technology has significantly improved the ability for humans to live longer. And when humans are living longer, and babies within a year are not dying as commonly as they had in the past, then that has had a significant demographic impact as a result. And so something that to keep in mind as a whole, like where we are and in our populations continue to rise and rise. And despite the pandemic that's going on now, the general populations will continue to rise more and more. So I have no doubt about that. So diseases associated with poverty persisted while other diseases emerged that were new epidemics and threats to human populations, in some cases leading to social disruption. Boy, does that really reign true in today's world. These outbreaks spurred technological and medical advances, and some diseases occurred at higher increase merely because of increased longevity. So let's look at some of these diseases, some examples, and to thank Ben Freeman, who put together this graphic several years ago. It's something I've always used in my class because it just highlights everything just on one page. So let's talk about new epidemics that go on, okay? And of course, the coronavirus that's going on today is a good example of a new epidemic. But before there was coronavirus, there's some other ones, other examples that should be mentioned. And one was the 1918 flu outbreak, sometimes referred to as the Spanish flu. And the reason it's called the Spanish flu is because it happened right in the midst of World War One. And where it came from is anyone's guess. There is a possibility it came from the United States and found its way over to Europe. But during World War One, you had a lot of soldiers in the trenches who were dying of this flu, and it also affected civilian populations too. And the countries that were at war didn't want to report about what is going on in the epidemic and everything. The governments didn't do a lot to alert the people about this and what things they needed to do to stop it because of the fear of alerting their enemies that, oh, hey, we're a lot of us are being affected and significantly weakened by this disease that's going on. We don't want our enemy to try to take advantage of that. Well, they didn't know that they were also inflicted with it as well. And so one country that was reporting that was going on in their country was Spain. And so a lot of people called it the Spanish flu because Spain was the only one taking responsibility that was actually happening there. But the 1918 flu outbreak was pretty devastating to parts of the world. Roughly 30 million, almost 30 million people died because of this disease. And we can never know fully how many people did, but roughly around 30 million people died worldwide. Over 600,000 people died here in the United States because of the influenza outbreak. And it was a pretty nasty pandemic. And, things that are going on in 1918 are very similar to what's going on now. Some countries some states and cities outlawed, large gatherings like theaters, churches, things like that, to try to stop the spread of it. Today we call it social distancing. It was very similar back in 1918. They didn't have a name for it, but basically they told people stay home, do not go out, cover yourselves with masks if you're going to be in public. So you can pull up on the internet lots of pictures of the 1918 pandemic, and you'll see people wearing masks and trying to slow the spread of it. And it came and went, and then it came back again, and so forth. So the flu is around today. A lot of the reasons why it's not as much of a danger, even though it still is because our bodies have developed immunities to it, and plus the flu shot makes it more possible people to be their bodies are better prepared to fight a flu if they do come across it. Other new epidemics that occurred during this time period: HIV, AIDS, a sexually transmitted disease that spread in places like the United States. It spread in places in Africa, and a lot of it's general misinformation about the disease itself. But that is a disease that over time has lessened, but it's still very much around today. But we have new medical treatments. There isn't a cure, but there are treatments today that can make the disease pretty much go into hibernation, and you can live a fairly normal life. So that's something that is important to note. But HIV, a new epidemic that comes on during this time period. And another one is Ebola, which doesn't really affect certain parts of the world because the environment it needs to survive. But places within Africa where you have this tropical heat year round and so forth, the Ebola epidemic will kill many, many, many people in West and Sub-Saharan Africa. Because of that, the environment that it can survive in and so forth. And so the Ebola epidemics and these outbreaks have happened in the 90s and the 2000s. And it's something that continues to be worked on as a way to try to stop and control that. You have these outbreaks every now and a while and such, and then World Health Organization, Doctors Without Borders, and other international community support try to stop that from spreading any further. So, all right. So now we also have diseases with lifestyle changes. And some of these are going to occur because, the fact that humans are living longer, there's going to be strains on their body that kind of develop new diseases. One would be Alzheimer's. And so Alzheimer's is usually associated with people who generally get older. And people develop symptoms of forgetfulness. They develop other symptoms and so forth that go with it. It's a very terrible disease. It's sometimes referred to as the long goodbye, because people forget where they are, they forget who they are, they forget the loved ones in their lives and such. But a lot of that is associated with a change in lifestyle, the ability to be able to live longer. And just the brain cannot survive as long as the body in some cases, unfortunately. And Alzheimer's is one of those diseases that are associated with that lifestyle change. Another one is diabetes. And the diabetes epidemic, it's a lot of it has to do with our change in lifestyles. We eat more foods with higher concentrations of fats, sugars, and carbohydrates. And as a result, more people develop the disease of diabetes, where your body can't regulate its blood sugar levels and so forth. We're not doing it as exercising as much. We have transportation by car and such. We're not walking around as much as we used to. So there's a lot of things and lifestyle changes that play a role into why diabetes is something that has become a bit of an epidemic and in parts of the world. The United States, as you can see from this graph, and Canada are two places that are most associated with diabetes in the world today. Italy, also, one of them is such. But a lot of it has to do with diet and lifestyle and how people live their lives. And then there's also heart disease, which heart disease itself can be associated with a couple of things. It could be diet. It is partly diet and lifestyle. Things like smoking, eating high or foods with high fats, and cholesterol that plays a role in it. And it also has to do with people living longer. I mean, the longer you live, the more that the cholesterol will continue to clog the arteries in your heart and such, to where people's hearts will give out because they can't continue to pump at the rate they are. So with all the plaque and stuff that's clogging their hearts. Okay, so that's another example of a disease that comes with lifestyle change. And the last one are diseases that are associated with poverty. These are diseases that continue. They've been around for a very long time. And so parts of the world where there is not as much access to vaccines, as much access to medical information and so forth, and how to prevent the spread of these diseases, or the inability to create infrastructure to stop the ability for diseases to continue to thrive, still is going to plague the parts of the world that are impoverished more so than the more developed parts of the world. So malaria there is a cure or treatments for to prevent malaria and so forth. But again, it's not something that is always available to the parts of the world. And that's, today malaria tends to be one of the number one killers as far as diseases go in parts of the world today. Africa, with Ebola and AIDS being a disease that hit that continent very hard in some places, malaria continues to be the number one killer for them. And so that's a disease that persists and continues today from previous periods in history. Cholera is another one where it's something that you can contract through water. And so there's lots of parts of the world that don't have water treatment. And you can be drinking water that has the cholera bacteria in it. And that causes a lot of issues that are really icky that I don't want to talk about in the video. And that is something that persists today in lesser developed parts of the world, where they can't get access to clean and treated water sometimes. And the last one is tuberculosis. It's a lung disease that's airborne. In parts of the world, there's lots of treatments for tuberculosis and vaccine for tuberculosis, but sometimes those vaccines will not make it to parts of the world. It is an expensive one, and it is also hard to ship into places where there's not enough infrastructure to keep the medicine cool and so forth. And so being able to vaccinate parts of the world and try to stop the spread of that disease is not easy to do. I mean, Bill Gates and Melinda Gates have a foundation that they bought a fleet of helicopters that have refrigerator units on them, so they can fly into remote villages and vaccinate people to try to stop the spread of these diseases that can be preventable, but it's still a wide-scale issue around the world. So those are diseases that continue to be around today from previous period because of poverty and lesser development of nations around the world. Okay, so that's it. Very simple topic area. And so again, to what extent did disease change during the period of 1900 to the present? And again, try not to focus on what just the current situation today. You can include it in your answer, but think about the entirety of this time period. How has disease changed during this period, 1900 to the present? Okay. All right, everyone. Hope this finds you safe and healthy, and I will see you next time. Always freezes up on me here at the end.